Welcome back, and I think thanks for coming back for lunch. And I think we're now going pretty much straight into the second breakout session, which is looking at the major drivers and factors that could affect our ability to keep the UK food chain resilient, whilst avoiding negative consequences. And so that's thinking particularly about broader and global big scale sort of drivers and factors, political factors, economic, social, technical, legal, so on and so forth. So you will shortly be put into the same breakout groups, I think, as this morning, and we will see you back here in about an hour. Thank you. The breakout groups, we had some very interesting discussions, and I hope you did too. What we're going to do now is move on to the plenary session to report back from what the various breakout groups have found. And so we will start with Rosie Oakes looking at low rainfall, droughts and wind and storms. Rosie.
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, we had a good discussion. I think this was, I found it harder than the previous one. The discussions were kind of much broader. So yes, so we had the low rainfall and drought. We had, for the most uncertain, we had, is it actually feasible to have these local supply chains? So we talked a lot previously about maybe moving towards more local supply chains, but we don't know whether that's actually possible, because it would mean a big shift from what we have right now. So that was our first one. And the second one is what will consumer attitudes be towards different and new crops? So we talk about maybe having to change the crops based on the climate, but what are the consumers going to think about that? We don't really know. So they're our most uncertain. And then our most important or critical, the top one was kind of maintenance of science funding, to have that evidence base to make decisions on. We think that's very important. And the other one was the need to look for kind of more long-term planning. So, you know, most people, instead of planning for season to season, and maybe this year it's cheaper to buy crops from a different place, you can't just suddenly decide next year, oh, we'll just grow them at home. It doesn't work like that. It has to have this much longer term outlook. And that would need to come kind of through the food chain all the way from farmers, with support from policymakers. So yeah, some pretty big challenges. So I popped those in the chat in case people prefer to read. And then our second one was wind and storms. And again, like I said, on this one, we found there were much more similarities between the two boards, because when we start thinking about these kind of bigger challenges across the food chain. So in this case, we put for our most uncertain consumer challenges around higher or more variable food prices. And that's something that we've seen a little bit this year based on, for example, what's happening in Ukraine. That's had impacts on food prices. And are consumers going to become more used to those variable food prices? Is that something we need to consider? So that was one of our most uncertain ones. The second one was, we talked a lot about kind of reusing crops in previous sessions, you know, if they have been damaged due to climate impacts, but do we actually have the technology that we need to do that? So that was one of our big uncertainties. And then most important and critical, the science funding did come up again, but I haven't written that down twice. Instead, we've put trying to understand the cost benefit and co-benefit of doing some of these adaptations. So, you know, what are the financial implications? Are there win-wins that are going to come in if we put some of these adaptation strategies in place? And then we also had a really interesting discussion around packaging and recycling. But I think, you know, in terms of the pestle and the UK food supply chain, the most important thing is, like, there needs to be some technology developed or regulation around sustainable packaging, or packaging that's created from waste. So that would be a win-win, kind of fits in a couple of areas there, but we need to do some work on making sure that all gets put in place. So that was it from us. Thanks, Pete.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks, Rosie. We too had some, yeah, found it more challenging, I think, as well, moving away from the specific and into the broader, and some interesting, yeah, some common themes with what you found as well, though, to some extent. can we now move to Andrew Cottrell on high rainfall, flooding, compound events and combinations? Thank you.
Of course, thanks, Pete. Yeah, again, so interesting discussions and yeah, some overlap both between the things that we looked at and I'm sure with the other groups. There was an interesting theme that came up that producers hold most of the risk and the cost, and retailers hold most of the power, if you like, which gives quite an interesting dynamic within the food chain. Focusing on the producer aspect, something that came up with I know it was phrased as distrust between farmers and government, but that's not that was more a sort of a lack of confidence in long-term policy, and given a lot of the things that we've discussed in terms of the adaptation options and the strategies will take a lot of time to deliver, and actually that long-term policy is was one of the key sort of drivers that might be valuable. Other important things are a land use framework, which is seems to be getting increasingly high profile recently, but that seems like a really valuable way of being able to make trade-offs between some of the options and strategies that we discussed, like the rewilding options and the forestry, agroforestry, and actual crop or livestock production. So that sounds quite a critical thing to have available. A couple of the more uncertain aspects we came up with: novel diets. I know Rosie mentioned a few of these in terms of novel crops, but insect protein got some interest in our group. It remains pretty uncertain as to whether that will become a significant part of the UK diet. We'll see. Slightly more broadly than that, then the political will to encourage or incentivize or regulate for changes in consumer preferences is quite a key driver for some of these aspects. Okay, I think that was the key points on the flooding aspect. So for the compound events, I'm not sure really how distinct these are, but a couple of points that I don't think have come up so far. So the international aspect, an international context seems quite a big driver for being resilient to these potentially severe compound events, and maybe that's it's the international situation as to how likely countries are to have protectionism and or restricting exports, and part of that might just be the degree of international cooperation that exists that might allow more multi-country cooperation in terms of understanding the risks and working to develop networks that minimize those across country boundaries, which could be interesting. We talked about the important role of retailers and the power dynamics that I mentioned earlier. How do you actually go about affecting retailer behavior and choices? And actually consumers probably ends up as being the main driver of retailer decisions. And one final point to make just about that is probably as uncertain as anything in the overall UK economic situation has a significant impact on how much funding is available to support all the exciting things that we've talked about today and last week about helping to deliver diversification or nature-based solutions or infrastructure or training or whatever it is. The amount of money available for that is a key driver. I will stop there. Back to you, Pete.
Thank you very much, Andrew. interesting points. Oh, and actually just noticing Anna's also putting all those points in the chat, so you can read them if you'd like to. I will just quickly go through some of what we found in the breakouts looking at heatwave, high temperature and the international dimensions. We had some interesting discussions to a degree about understanding the nature of what we were trying to do, and particularly when thinking about these drivers, who would be impacted by them, and trying to identify more clearly whether we were thinking about activities only in the food chain or the outcomes, and so on and so forth. So yeah, some interesting discussions around that and the boundaries really. In terms of where we got to, having bottomed some of that out for heatwave and high temperature, one of the two most uncertain ones were firstly around consuming and the need to be careful that resilient diet information is clear and is a uniform and a blanket strategy nationally and across social media and so on, and obviously somewhat difficult to control in the latter context. In terms of packaging, there was sort of a dual aspect of uncertainty to that as to whether the impact of developing and I guess producing as well smart packaging might balance out any environmental benefits on the other hand, so it's of its use in practice and disposal and so on, and its resilience to climate change, as well as again technology came back, the availability and affordability of technology to support the development of smart packaging. In terms of the most important factors and drivers in responding to heatwave, high temperature, in terms of storage, the cost of implementation of renewable energy generation and renewable energy sources for cooling, given that's been identified as a priority measure, but also in wholesale and retail, the requirement for cooperation and incentives in stress testing supermarket supply chains. So there's a sort of an economic, but also a broader, perhaps political sense to that. And then in international dimensions, the most uncertain things that we looked at were around processing and packaging again, and potentially resistance to the need for increased information from, or the increased down through the chain about the nature of products and the risks and contaminants and so on, as well as labeling and transparency by the trade partners overseas, but also for the broader food system as a whole, legislation internationally and buy-in for global regional standards on resilience and food safety. The most important factors, though, for the international aspects of the food chain were seen as consuming. More of a local impact than one directly on the UK. So if we're seeing big breadbasket failures or reduced yields in big breadbasket import regions, then they'll tend to keep more produce for themselves. And that could be a whole spectrum, all the way from a yield reduction and a smaller impact on simply the balance between import and export, all the way out to sort of total failures and food shortages and so on. So there's a big impact on consumer behaviours and the local markets and economy. As well as there was some talk there as well about local livelihoods and the impacts of changing food sources. And in terms of producing, we also found that political and legal dimensions were important in terms of the incentives that would be provided, particularly overseas, to farmers to adapt to changes in climate and how they might support the overall goals of resilience. And for the wider food system, finally, the role of overseas development spend, ODA spend, and philanthropic funds, and where they're targeted, is seen as quite key in supporting resilience and capacity building. So I will now hand over to Stacey, who's going to talk us through cold wave and the cold events, snow, low temperature, and storm surges.
Great, thanks, Pete. So as Pete said, we're going to talk about cold wave and snow, low temperature first. So in terms of most uncertain, we had lack of investment in rural transport networks in the transport and trading sector, And in terms of producing, attitudes to risk and rewards, so farmers and businesses and supermarkets, going back to the incentivizing businesses and farmers to make changes. So how do we change those attitudes to risk and reward? In terms of most important or critical, we had, again, in the transport and trading, I'm surprised this hasn't come up before, but we had Brexit and the relationships with the EU, which generated some nice conversations. We talked about if there has been a pestle approach done for Brexit, and if there is, we'd love to see it. We talked about increasing cost of climate secure, safe storage solutions, and linked to this, the increasing cost of energy. So keeping it topical again around the increased use of energy use and increased price of energy as well. In terms of the whole food system, we had quite a few in the blue post-its. One that we spoke about quite a lot was around apathy to contingency planning for rare risks. So even if there's a significant impact, we talked about how there's likely to be less pressure from the public to prepare for events that have not happened in recent memories. So the 1953 storm surge came up, and pandemics. So this is, I spoke a lot about the work we do in China and kind of like the community and the culture there. They rely quite a lot on the passing down of information and events. And if something hasn't happened in recent memory or has been spoken about in a community, they're kind of less likely to take warnings and threats and risk, take that on board. So how do we communicate that through case studies and things like that? So we had a really good discussion around communication. And then again, on the social economic, addressing potential conflicts between resilience and business efficiency. So that was cold wave and snow. Moving on to storm surge, most uncertain was mitigation measures are likely to have costs, for example, loss of farming land, money, or ugly infrastructure, which I thought was quite interesting, which would be a deterrent. So how do we make this hard engineering, I guess, going back to sea walls, how do we make that more beneficial? And I think Freya spoke about, especially on the coast with storm surges, tourism, and that could have an impact on tourism. And I think that's something that we haven't talked about before across the groups, is kind of on the coast, the impact on other kind of sectors such as tourism and losses of money from that. In terms of most important and critical, we had the most productive land in the UK is found near the coast. So how do we protect that in the future? And food price increases and inflation compounded by extreme weather impacting availability and price, so the cascading risks with food prices. And then looking at the whole food system, we had more localized issues, so different management compared to more national issues. So with storm surges, it was brought up that this is likely to impact more localized areas, but obviously where you've got like power stations and you've got important supplies of food, obviously this will have a national risk, but storm surges are most likely to have the biggest impact on these local communities. So how do we make sure they're not forgotten when we think about wider kind of legislation? And then we had the cost of land and property in the UK is very high, which is disincentive to move facilities despite the risk. So we've got, for example, building a new London. So the price of moving a farm might outweigh the risk. So that was quite an important discussion we had. And then we had a few other things which I thought were important to kind of raise. We had really good discussion on what exactly is food waste. So I was very guilty of just thinking that this was out of date food, but I think Karish brought this up, that it's not just out of date food, it's broken biscuits. And we had a very interesting discussion around wonky carrots. And I think you mentioned, Pete, around social media, and we talked about, how do we get social perception around food and buying food? How do we change that? So we were talking about a wonky carrot doesn't have a different nutritional value than a straight carrot. So how do we change public perception? So, doing a fun TikTok video with someone dancing around with a wonky carrot, we had some wild discussions around wonky carrots. And then around kind of like at the end of a conference, if you have food waste and you want to give that to a local homeless shelter or something like that, where does the liability fall if you know, with the food safety standards. So that puts a lot of people off. Yeah, what about turnips? We didn't talk about turnips, just wonky carrots. But yeah, with kind of the liability, if we're going to give food away and like community support systems, where does that liability fall if someone gets food poisoning or something like that? And then we had towards the end, I think it's really important to raise, is that we had a really great discussion around social science and how important that is today. And, you know, understanding the impact of climate change on farmers' mental health was raised as well, something often forgotten around mental health and physical health. What support systems can we put in place for farmers to help them you know, feel more supported across the whole supply chain? So if there is a failed harvest, how can the whole supply chain support farmers? And kind of related to the communication side of things, how do we ensure that we don't communicate too much? I think throughout the discussions over the past 2 days, especially in our group, we've talked about how we need more communication, but how do we ensure that we don't do too much communication and people become kind of numb to the risk? So I was talking about Helen Roberts' work with the 2 storms, so Storm Eunice and Storm Dennis and Storm Eunice, and she was talking about how people weren't impacted that much by the first storm, Storm Dennis, I think, so that when Storm Eunice came around, they thought, oh, I wasn't that affected by Storm Dennis. They carried on like normal, but obviously the risks and the threat of Storm Eunice was much more. So I thought that was a really good example that I've heard recently from Helen Roberts, who works at the Met Office, who is looking more at the social side of risk. So I just wanted to raise that. So social science is really important. So yeah, that's it from our group.
Thank you, Stacey. There's some really interesting themes there, actually, and I think yeah, the social science point is a really good one. We also talked to some degree about that in our group, and I think there was a bit of a consistent theme in some of the earlier breakout sessions around the need for interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approaches to this challenge. And I think it's been really interesting. Clearly, it's been quite a challenging conversation, trying to draw out some of these drivers and factors. But it does seem to me there are some common themes around policy and effective regulation, around UK and international aspects of that as well, the need to understand that broader context. And you make a good point about trading in EU as well, Stacey. Actually, that's yeah, an obvious one that was in there. Lots on the social side, linking back to the social science side of around attitudes, acceptance, perception. I think also around the planning and behavioural change as well, and making these changes happen. And when we move through to the technological side, you know, it's obviously all very well having all the technological solutions if they aren't implemented, used effectively in practice, and don't work for the users and the actors in the industry, as well as the need socially for more, I guess, cooperation sort of slightly straddles that boundary of social and political will, really, and to some degree economic with the industry too, and effective communication. Economics too, I think something else there in that multidisciplinary approach around the cost of options, the feasibility, local impacts, and the context into which we're bringing solutions into, as well as the need for funding to support the right pieces of work and the key priorities. And in terms of technology as well, a lot around the costs and the viability, as well as it being available. So lots to think about there, and lots to build on and take forward. We do have a little bit of time now before our key speakers begin. We've probably got about 15-20 minutes. If anyone wants to raise any points based on what they've heard or seen in the chat there on the screen, and to have a bit of a broader discussion around this exercise in particular now. So just open up the floor either through the chat or the Q&A, or raise your hand. Let us know what you're thinking, if your brains aren't too tired from that exercise, which mine is quite. Bernd, you've got your hand up. Yes. Please, could we unmute Bernd Teggen? Thank you.
All right, yeah, thanks, Pete, and whoever unmuted me. I just, there's something that sort of I remembered from a science article a few years ago, which looked at another negative effect of climate change onto crops and nutrition, and that was that because the plants are being able to get the CO2 more easily into the systems, they don't need as much of the enzyme machinery. So we're basically talking proteins, we're talking trace elements and so on. And so they did some research on that in that article and came to the conclusion that elevated CO2 levels are actually detrimental to the nutritional value of some of the key crops that the world's population relies upon. So it's a kind of more direct climate change effect. I just wonder if anyone else has followed this or knows about this kind of research, because I've not sort of kept up with that. Just sort of wanted to put it out there. Thanks.
Just a quick answer. I mean, I think in general, the work that traces all the way through from sort of primary impacts on production to nutrition is not as widespread, shall we say, as sort of the individual sectors and individual pieces of the jigsaw. But I am aware of some of the work with Jenny McDermid and others at the University of Aberdeen, and actually we've been involved a little in some of that work in a GRCF program called AfriCap, which was looking at building integrated assessment frameworks. So it's somewhat away from necessarily drawing the nuts and bolts of models together, but more about ways that you pull together sources of information, including expert groups and so on. So I think there's a paper out by Stuart Jennings in, I think it's Environmental Research Letters on that. I'm just trying to think what the tool is called. I have completely forgotten. It will come to me, but there's a paper, I think it was a paper this year or last by Jennings et al. On there, on basically smart sort of pathways, climate smart pathways. So worth looking up. But iFeed, that's right, Tom. Thank you very much in the chat there. iFeed. Keris, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. I was just going to type, someone has to unmute me. Yeah, just going to follow up on what Bernd said. Yeah, so I'm also aware that CO2 levels increase, it changes the balance of carbon and nitrogen in crop plants.
You're slightly breaking up there, Keris.
I'm just going to put my headphones in. I don't know if that's any better.
That's better. Thank you.
Cool. That's all right. So increasing CO2 changes the carbon nitrogen balance in plants. So negatively carbon, but relatively less nitrogen, which has impacts on the protein content of some of these crops that we might grow, which of course then has not only implications for manufacturing processes, but also on nutrition. I think that I was going to say something else now, and I've forgotten. Oh, I guess there are potential benefits of carbon dioxide. I think it might change the thickness of the epidermis, perhaps change stomata size and perhaps frequency. So actually, it might make some crops more drought resilient. Yeah, but I think what's not clear from some of the research, if you're hearing me, it looks like you might be struggling, is whether this is at an extreme CO2 level. I'm not sure what might happen at various levels between where we are are now perhaps 800 ppm CO2, which was research.
Maybe I just, yes, that sounds definitely breaking up again. I'm not quite sure why, but I think, I mean, you could maybe paste something into the chat also if I haven't got the gist of it. But I think the gist of your question or comment was around the more complex impacts of climate change on the crops, sort of beyond yield and on nutrient content and on the grain, but also on stomatal conductance. And we know in higher CO2 that the plant stomata, the little pores on the leaves, open more. So I think I've got this the wrong way around, so that they're actually more efficient in terms of water use, and less efficient in terms of water use. I think they use there's more runoff ends up on the land as a fraction, basically, and that then has impacts, well, particularly the quality and nature of the grain on processing and so on. So I think there's quite a bit of research on the CO2 impacts, but I'm less certain on the nutritional content. Okay, I'll see if you can paste something. I'm not sure if I've entirely captured your question. Has anyone else got their hands up?
There's a question from Monica, or two questions from Monica in the chat. So what are the next steps in the analysis, and how are you bringing together the drivers in the analysis for the different climate change impacts? Sure,
yeah, so I will go over this at the end as well in a bit more detail, but we are going to sort of draw together some of the findings in a workshop report and see where we go from there. Really, the aim of the drivers impact or the drivers analysis work here was to just sort of generate some lists and try to understand what a more community view of those factors and impacts were to start with, and see whether that might inform or what the next steps might be towards a scenario exercise. So yeah, it's sort of a scoping exercise for a scenario exercise, if you like. Yeah, and I hope we'll be able to share I'm hoping we'll be able to do something a bit more creative with some of the summaries and the findings as well that we can share. We will be back in touch once we've had a chance to pull things a bit more together. And of course, a lot of the summary stuff here, we really are distilling down what's on the board. So there's lots and lots of detail there that we don't want to lose. Thank you.
We also had a question from Nicola. So yeah, I saw your question in the Q&A, Nicola. So what plans are there to get views from areas / stakeholders not represented by participants at this workshop? So yeah, a really important question, I think.
That is a really interesting one. So and in honesty, not one I have yet considered, but it's a really good point in depth. An immediate one is I think Riaz Bano's also on the call from the Global Food Security Programme, but I've been presenting on this activity generally to the Global Food Security Programme and talking about the progress with them. So that's sort of a grouping across UK funders and government departments and with an interest in food security. But it would be really nice to find a way to, once we've summarised where we've got to find a way to get views from a broader group. And we will have a think about that. Thank you, Nicola. Bernd's put something in about CO2 and nutritional content. Yes. From a 2019 paper. Yeah, so there's a bit of a debate there about increasing CO2. Well, and I think also climate extremes as well and their impact on nutrients. I think there's some understanding that climate extremes themselves, as well as CO2, could reduce nutrient content of crops. Any more comments or questions? See any hands up? Dominic, tools or websites used to predict which crops can be grown in the UK in the future. Yeah, interesting point. So there is, I think Tom's on the call, Tom Crocker. There's a tool I think that CEH and Rothamsted are involved in. Is that right?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. So I'm not aware of all the details because I'm not running this project, but we've been talking to researchers at UKCEH who are doing some research using something called the EcoCrop database, which some people, yes, start my video. There we go, sorry. Yes, so some of you may be aware of the EcoCrop database, which I think was originally produced by the FAO. And they've been essentially using this database along with a relatively simple model that they've developed themselves to essentially try and produce kind of maps of suitability of a variety of different crops across the UK, basically, and then looking at those maps both under present day climate and then also using Met Office projections to see how that changes in the coming decades, basically. And the goal of that, I think, is to, yeah, ultimately try and identify some interesting alternative crops that may be suitable in the future for the UK. Gain a bit more insight about the particular regions that might be most suitable, and then the model they built is relatively simplistic, so it obviously misses some what will be important factors, but it essentially kind of can point the way to sort of potentially promising things that should be looked into further, basically. I think they're in the process of kind of writing up the sort of paper associated with that work. So I'm pretty sure there should be something published on it this year. Whether whether there's going to be a sort of publicly available tool to sort of explore their results, I'm not 100% sure, but I think such a thing would potentially be quite useful, and something that we'll maybe think about discussing with them to see if we can be involved in maybe developing something like that.
Yeah, I have some awareness, and I would need to come back on this, but I think there's a piece of work with the Food Farming and Countryside Commission looking at sort of UK production and what we might produce within the UK, and where. I don't know if it's going into sort of that detail in terms of sort of regional mapping. Yeah, so Nicola also says awareness of areas interests that are overrepresented here is also important in interpreting highly voted subjects too. Yeah, absolutely. And from Dominic, important to consider what current crops won't be grown in locations where they are now. Yeah, as Tom says, I'm not entirely sure on the details of that project, but worth reaching out to the folks at CEH if you're interested too. Any more brief questions or comments? We do have some time as well at the end after the perspectives. What I might suggest then, if we're quiet for now, is we have a brief break and come back, maybe a 7-minute break and come back at 3:15 for the summing up session, if that's okay with everyone. So we'll stick to the timetable, just have a short break now before we hear back from Judith and Luke. Thank you. Okay, thank you everyone for coming back, and we're now moving into the closing session of our workshop, and I'd now like to introduce Judith Batchelar from Food Matters International, who are very pleased to have Judith with us here today, and also she kindly, I've lost my video, there we go, very kindly opened the workshop too and has great experience in the industry. And Judith, we'd really like to hear your thoughts and reflections on the journey we've been on the last 2 days of this workshop. Thank you.
Brilliant, and good afternoon, everybody. And I'm very conscious Friday afternoon. Your energy levels must be getting quite low. So don't worry, I haven't got a big PowerPoint presentation, and I'm not going to speak for the next 30 minutes. So you're safe. But I suppose the key thing for me really is to say well done. I really enjoyed reading the summary of your discussions over the 2 days, and there are some real insights in there for me, and thinking about what next for all of you, and the hard work that you've put into the summary documents that I've had the privilege to have a look at. And I suppose the first thing to say from my perspective is I've spent my whole life as a practitioner, so getting things done, driving change and trying to make a difference. And the one thing that always happens in these sort of situations is you've got some fantastic ideas, you've got some fantastic insights that you've worked on together, and things that are clear to take forward. So whether that's your quick wins or whether it's some of the major projects that you've identified. But the key thing for me in all of these things is how do you make sure that those things come to pass, as it were, and become a reality? So what is it in there that needs to happen to make those things possible? And, you know, whether that's possible in 5 years' time, or whether that's possible with some of the quick wins in the next couple of years, what do you need? And what do I mean by that? I think there are a number of things that always need to be in place that create what I call an enabling environment. And some of those things are pretty straightforward. They're things like regulation, they're things like policies, but some of those things are not quite so obvious. And for example, the skills and the capabilities of boards who are making decisions about big investments, or whether it's investors themselves having the right level of knowledge. So thinking as you go through that list of, I say, regulation, investment, and what investors need, how businesses make decisions, how you create I suppose the chances, how you skew the odds of these things being successful and being implemented is key. So that would be my first bit of advice. And if anybody wants anything on creating an enabling environment, I've got some things that I've done historically around how you create that enabling environment by having the system in the room and knowing who your system stakeholders are, and all of the things that create what I would call a broader business case than just the financial business case. And you've touched on some of those things. So I say, if anyone's interested, I can share those things. They might be helpful. There were also some things on there that I thought were missing, and I say that from sort of, what's the word? Personal experience. And I'll give you a good example, actually, because this morning I was visiting a desalination plant. And this desalination plant is there for, you know, the worst case scenario, because if anybody knows anything about desalination, it's very expensive. So and very energy intensive and not very sustainable. So you only use it as a last resort. And you really think it's either a desalination plant or it's no water coming out of consumers' taps. And one of the things around desalinated water is it tastes very different from the water that you have. And water, as we know, tastes very different as you go around the country. So if you're used to very hard water in the southeast versus soft water in other parts of the country, and you try and make your cup of tea and it doesn't quite taste the same. And I know this from my Sainsbury's days, you get lots of complaints. And that's not helpful. But there is a piece of legislation, actually, in the drinking water regulations that says if consumers don't like the taste of their water, then it is classified as unwholesome and therefore technically illegal to supply. And that is a taste thing. Now, that may have been true many years ago because taste was a reflection on the quality of the water. But today, you know, we can measure the specification of drinking water to very, very low levels. And we're all very clear that the water is safe and it is drinkable and in the case of, is it drought and extreme climate weather, is the piece of regulation around whether drinking water is wholesome or not a piece of legislation that probably needs revisiting. So I think there are things around, is our regulatory framework fit for purpose more generally in these things? And I think that is a really rich theme if you wanted to explore it. The other thing that, and I may have missed it, that I thought was quite interesting was around a lot of really good stuff around crops, livestock, all of the issues around higher temperatures, lower temperatures, what that means, rainfall, etc. But there wasn't much about covered systems, i.e. covered crops. And covered crops have historically meant greenhouses that are costly and expensive and all the things that we know about traditional greenhouses. But there are some really interesting things around covered crops. And I use an example along the south coast where there is a lot of geothermal energy, where geothermal glass houses that are able to produce covered crops in a way that is really pretty sustainable versus things like combined heat and power generators that would have been used historically. So I think there are some interesting themes to explore. And then the last one would be around people and working conditions and worker rights and what that means. And I don't know if any of you have been watching the tennis in Australia, but clearly at points when it was 37 degrees and amazing humidity, the players literally, they had to stop play. There's going to be a lot more of that. And it's not just about elite sport, it's about people in fields, people in fields in hot countries and all of the things we know about that. So I think there is more work to do here. Not that, Pete, I want to encourage you to run yet another workshop, but there is so much in this. And then I suppose the last thing really is how we move at pace and how we move as sectors on this. And one of the things that has worked in the past quite well, and not in this space, but actually in the nutrition space, has been setting up of research clubs. And in fact, we have one that's been set up in the last 6 months in nutrition again, which is an open innovation research club. But it's essentially creating a platform where everyone can share cutting edge research and also can collectively identify where the gaps are in that research. And I do think that some of these topics do lend themselves to a more collaborative approach to research, and in the broadest sense. So not just from an academic point of view, but from a business point of view, from a regulator point of view, from an investor point of view. So I think mechanisms for delivering all of this, as well as creating the enabling environment for some of these ideas to really land on their feet and get going from day one, is also important. But I just say, you know, well done. There's some great insights in here, and I feel really privileged to have been able to spend a few minutes at the beginning of this, but also a few minutes at the end of it, sharing my thoughts. So thank you very much, Pete.
Always very insightful, and I think there are some really useful thoughts for us moving forwards, particularly actually I think in day one, some of the discussion at the end, there was some discussion around how we move forward, and some thoughts about a community approach to this and building a community. So the thoughts about the research club are really interesting and quite valuable. And I'd say in some ways quite timely, that I think in terms of UK climate resilience generally, there was the big SPF project on UK climate resilience, which has just come to a close, and did have some theme around, or some projects around agri-food and resilience, but perhaps not with the breadth that we're talking about here too. But it's also, as you say, the ability to share and collaborate in a more interactive way. So let's see. Yes, very open to suggestions and ideas. Thank you very much again for joining.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And now I'd like to invite Dr. Luke Spadavecchia from DEFRA to share with us his thoughts on what we've achieved and learnt in the workshop. Great to have you with us, Luke.
Thanks, Pete, and great to be here. I've really enjoyed participating actually over the last 2 days. I've been working on the agri-food and climate agenda for over a decade now, and having a discussion like the one that we've had over the past sort of 2 days has been really invigorating actually, and has really kind of sparked a lot of thought. So it's been great to kind of share that creativity with you all over the course of the discussions. And I think these have generated a greater understanding of some of the threats and issues that are going to be important to frame our thinking in response to the third climate change risk assessment, and really help us in government shape our response in terms of the third national adaptation programme. The discussions have kind of made it clear that there's a lot to do actually to ensure that our food system's resilient to the impact of climate change. But I think a key point for me is that learning lessons from COVID, we've seen that although some individual supply chains can be quite fragile, overall food supplies in the UK have proven to be incredibly resilient in the face of that significant shock. And resilience to deal with that, and to deal with extreme weather events and the challenges of the future, comes from having a really competitive, productive and sustainable sector. And that's where government's really focusing our efforts at the moment. But beyond that, there were 3 themes that really struck me and emerged throughout the discussions. And the first one is that we must really continue to innovate and trial novel approaches to production and management across the food system. And I don't want to be misunderstood there. When I say innovation, that covers the full range of technologies, from learning from traditional methods, nature-based solutions, regenerative practices, whilst at the same time embracing the best of new technology and what that can bring to the table. And of course, there's huge potential in big data, artificial intelligence and kind of data processing technologies, the traditional engineering technologies, but also in biotechnology. And I'd include in that the potentially transformational role of precision breeding and the contributions that the current genetic technologies bill could bring. And I suppose that leads me to a second point really around, alongside that innovation in practice, there's a need for social innovation and behavioural shift to accommodate those adaptive practices and products, as well as bringing stakeholders along with us as we innovate the food system. This shouldn't be something that's being done to people, it's something that's being done with their participation. And alongside that, as Judith reflected, we need a sufficient policy and regulatory landscape to support that shift. And within that, there's a lot of scope for mutual learning. And one of the things that really struck me is the value of sharing experiences with those who are already living with climatic extremes, be that in the UK or beyond. And of course, the role of social sciences in all of this is absolutely critical. And finally, the thing that really came through strongly to me is the need to continue to address the missing middle in the food system, to ensure that food chains remain resilient to those exogenous shocks in transport, material supply and trade that we've seen over the past few years. That includes engaging those who convene international conventions and rules, such as the World Trade Organization, and we've spoken a bit about that today. And I think our discussions made some real inroads on those aspects, actually. You know, we tend to be strong on thinking about pre-farm gate commodity production, and then we're pretty good at thinking about kind of the sort of manufacture and supply side of things, but it's those perhaps less direct actors in the food chain that need to be brought to bear on this, and the role that transport, packaging, and those elements really have to play in all of this. And I thought that was very welcome over the past 2 days that we started to get into some of that. But of course, there's still more to do in this space. So finally, I'd just like to take the chance to thank the organisers for a really successful workshop and for managing and engaging in really open and wide-ranging discussion around what is a really important issue. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the outputs of this and continuing to work with you all to enhance the resilience across the agri-food system. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Luke. Yeah, really glad you found it useful. And I think, again, there's some really useful insights in terms of moving forward, although I'm probably by nature more of a physical biological scientist. I couldn't agree more on the need for the social science and the interdisciplinary approach. Is actually on a personal level, working in projects where that's happened, it's something I think there's a real enjoyment and a real sense of achievement when you manage to make work happen across those boundaries. It can be challenging, but it's also what we need to do, and it's particularly for the food system, but for the big challenges of our day. And I think that's actually where where a lot of the work and collaborative research is going. I think critically, as you said, there's some different aspects to that around the need for bringing people along on the journey and that co-design and involvement in the solutions themselves, but how they're implemented as well as the learning and so on. So yeah, a really interesting dimension. And I think we had discussions in some of the groups we were both in around the topic of having fantastic technology, but no one that wants to use it. I've actually been personally involved in some sort of corporate change management in the last few years, and we quite often show people a slide of mobile phones throughout the years, and it's used basically to say, well, some people still have an enormous brick, and there are reasons for that. They don't want to come on the journey, all these factors that prevent them from moving into the future, and some of them might be quite valid, but it's in terms of when you move into industry and food security, it's a different context. Yeah, and I also very much appreciate the thinking about the missing middle too, and I think that's an area where we move into a much broader domain of industry, and it touches on other sectors and transport and other responsibilities, so it's quite complex. But thank you very much. Two very insightful talks, which I think were very welcome as part of this workshop, so thank you again. What we'll now do is move into a final sort of 15 minutes of question and answer and open feedback and discussion. So if anyone would like to ask questions, raise your hand or use the chat, and please do ask questions of us. Thank you. And that includes any feedback on the exercise and how it went, what we could improve, what went well and so on, or maybe what didn't. Very open to hearing that. Thank you. I'd also say, while I'm waiting, Judith, yeah, also would very much like to hear about the work on enabling environment, and very much in line with the comments Luke was making too. That'd be very useful.
Yeah, I was going to say just the whole thing around a connected business case, because the way that most businesses look at investment, and particularly investment in innovation, is in a very traditional single lens of return on investment from a financial point of view. So all of the things that Henry Dimbleby would have written about in the National Food Strategy around the externalities and the cost of those externalities in the way that we produce our food don't get factored in. So that's the first point. So you're including the scope of things that you would put into the business case. So nature, carbon, water, so on and so forth. The other thing around a connected business case is that you are looking at our whole system business case, because effectively what is going to happen with some of these innovations, and therefore the investments that need to happen to enable those innovations to be scaled and become common practice is that you need to potentially make investment in one part of the system, but the value is created in another part of the system, i.e. you're not investing in your own business and your own business is getting the benefits. Someone else is investing, normally further upstream in agriculture, in manufacturing and processing. The benefits of that are for everybody, and particularly consumers in a retail supply chain. Those benefits need to be paid for, or those investments rather need to be paid for. And that's the bit that we're not very good at. We're not very good at investing over here and giving a return on that investment over here. And that's what the connected business case tries to do as well as broadening the scope of what's included in that business case. It sounds really complicated, but you don't need to do it on everything. You just need to do it on the things that are material. And so if in your supply chain, the material thing is energy, or the material thing is air pollution, or the material thing is carbon, whatever it might be, is focusing on the 80-20. And when you do that, it works. The trouble, and there is the barrier to this, is essentially short-termism, because in order for those things to work, you need long-term relationships, partnerships, and longer-term visions, and we're not good at that at the moment. So I'll be quiet now because I can see some hands, or at least some chat.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, points. So there's some good comments about use of the online tools for discussion. Joe Galani, great to be in breakouts with people from diverse disciplines. I found that very interesting too. I guess actually here's a question from me to you all. Were there people missing either from this wider conversation, or in a general sense? It could be specific if you like, but I mean from sectors or businesses or piece, individual disciplines and expertise that you would have really liked to have seen here. We tried to cast the net wide, but it's hard to know quite what what you've captured on any one day. But yeah, it'd be good to hear that. And Monica, yes, indeed, we did have a discussion about the questions and moving towards sort of the second breakout session in the questions. I think that was more of a challenging question to ask around the uncertainties and the factors and drivers. But thank you. Question from Sarah, bridal to everyone. What is useful from the academic side? What can university researchers do to be most useful? Is that something I wonder if Luke or Judith might be prepared to offer an answer on?
I mean, I could have a go to kick us off with, which I think is, keeping doing what you're doing. This is a really important space, and one where there are still a huge number of uncertainties. We still don't really know what good looks like in some of this, and so I think it's really important that we continue to generate that knowledge. In terms of what could be done better, I think things like this workshop are really useful for greater coordination and bringing together disciplines. Making sure that we're taking a sort of end-to-end approach and thinking about things holistically and systemically. We talked a bit in our group about the difficulty of that, actually, given the complexity and the size of these problems. But I think, convening your energies and grouping around this issue is really important. It's certainly something that we need more creative thinking on to find solutions.
And I just had a couple of points to that. One is the point I made earlier around networks and sharing in that sort of pre-competitive space, best practice. And there is the Agri-Food for Net Zero Network Plus platform. So I genuinely would encourage everybody to join that, because it will create that platform that is sharing what's going on in the bigger, broader academic universe, and the more we can share, the better, because we'll all move quicker if we do that. So I would say the networking piece. And then the other thing I'd say is, don't assume that because the market isn't pulling hard enough on some of this research and innovation, that they're not interested in it. So the push and pull on research and innovation is really, really quite important. And almost it's kind of, people don't know what they don't know. And we always say, if you knew what I knew, what would you expect me to do? And I probably would expect you to tell me if you knew things that you thought would be helpful. So assume that at the market end of this and at the pull end, there is not a lot of pull because they don't know what they don't know. Therefore, you pushing would be a great idea. So, for example, getting together a whole group of retailers, manufacturers, processors, and creating, an innovation or research workshop that says, here are some of the things that we're doing. Almost a shop window, really, would be really helpful, because I think there is the pull there, but they just don't know what's available, genuinely. And it's, I suppose, there isn't a really easy shop window for research to connect to business. I mean, there is, but not in a way that is, every year, annually, there is a research and innovation showcase in agri-food, for example. That would be quite an interesting opportunity. I mean, I'm talking personally because I would love something like that, but it's it could be something that could be helpful.
It's a really good point. So I was actually going to ask, but in both, well, in a sense, you and Luke, but you've kind of somewhat answered as to whether there are more creative ways or that researchers can connect back to industry and policy. And of course, some of that will happen where there's a direct piece of work or a contract piece of work with an industry partner, or obviously funded work with policy departments and so on. But actually the idea of some kind of expo or annual gathering is an interesting one. I'd just like to point out to everyone too, yes, the links, both Sarah and I have very quickly bunged in the chat the link to the Agri-Food for Net Zero network. And whilst the focus is around net zero, there are also interests there in adaptation and resilience, and that's partly why I'm involved too. Very happy to be involved in that, and representing and trying to champion that as well, and ensure some of the thinking that we've brought here comes to that table as the network gets off the ground and gets underway. So a very exciting initiative. And I think, if I'm right, Sarah, if you're on the call, I think the ambition is that there could be hundreds or thousands of folks involved in this network right across the chain, from academia into industry and public, indeed, beyond.
Sorry, my headphones are talking to me. Yes, absolutely, Pete. And it's great that, so Pete is one of the specialist advisors to the network, and Judith, chair of the advisory board, with Charles Godfrey. And yeah, there's about it's over 300 people now signed up to it. But that's growing, and there's various tweets and so on. There's a big tent event in April, which we'd love to see you at, and that can be a bit of a shop window, hopefully, as well. But I think also it's useful to feed back from this meeting to some of the conversations we're having about the next couple of months, preparing for that big tent event, and feeding back that really some sort of summary or some sort of access to what's the current state of play in research might also be useful. And that's something that sort of seems so obvious to us as researchers. Sometimes it's hard to prioritize it. So hearing that from you again is really helpful, and we'll put more into that. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely. It'd be really exciting. So yeah, please do. If you have details of the event, I'll try and share them through the email chain as well. But for now, you've all got the link, so you should be able to see where to sign up, I think, for more information. So yeah, an interesting question. Actually, let me just see if there's something. So there's some really nice offers as well from Anthony at the FSA to drop him a link and keep in touch around policy. Fantastic. lots around of useful thinking from various folks around missing groups, which is useful, really useful. Keris Jones from the NFUs asked, wonder how quickly research can respond in light of speed of some of the changes. I think that depends. I can only speak in a sense these days from a Met Office and partners perspective, but actually we are able to be quite responsive, but partly through an area we have called applied science, which is more around and into consultancy and applied questions, but also the new academic partnership, which is now with 8 universities, has a framework agreement which allows us in particular to sort of have quite quick call-off contracts. But I know anyway, the length and pace of some of the more applied work is quite different to some of the longer term research programs and so on. Yeah, interesting too from Sylvia. So you joined a group which is very crop focused. Interestingly, in heat waves, we were very animal focused in the first day. And let's see what else we've got here. So yeah, some more good suggestions about missing people. Ways from Monica, ways to better assess and monitor innovations from different stakeholder lenses to understand trade-offs for each actor group. Monica, wondered if you be happy to expand on that point at all.
Sure. Thank you. It comes back to the discussion we had earlier around negative consequences for whom, that we always, for me, we need to ask that question, particularly in such a complex system as the current food system. What we know is that all the different options that we discussed across the different type of shocks, we haven't even started talking about the interaction of these shocks, maybe, in a sense, that they will have, different impacts on the one side across different parts of the food system and different actors in the system, but of course also the innovations we then bring into the system to deal with these shocks, which might make a lot of sense, let's say, from the farmer's perspective or the retailer's perspective. But we've already seen in the UK resilience program that I was a part of in coordinating, that what might help with the resilience on one part of the system might actually undermine the resilience of another part of the system, depending on how that looks like. So I think that whole understanding of what the different types of options and innovations are, be they technological or social or institutional, and from whose perspective are we basically understanding and evaluating the pros and cons and the trade-offs. And as I said earlier, that there are trade-offs doesn't mean that we might not use a particular type of technology or a particular type of innovation, but if we think in the systemic aspect that Judith was talking about earlier, then we would start working with these trade-offs right from the start, meaning with the actors that might lose out, and find ways of bringing them in, or of modifying things, or of compensating them for the loss that they have. But these are very, very different. So I mean, if we really think of a real systemic perspective on the system, then I think we also really need to evaluate innovation in a very different way than what we've done so far. And that's just what I wanted to bring in here, that we might have to apply different types of analysis to really find ways forwards, or to manage trade-offs and be upfront about them. If we think from a societal perspective, we nevertheless need to go down a particular path. I hope that helps to understand my cryptic short sentence there.
No, that's a really, really useful framing. And I think the two things I take away, and I think the resilience program, there's some really interesting findings and outcomes there. And I think partly what you're touching on as well is that it's really challenging to have and in some ways at any level, but a full system-wide approach that actually, because even if you minimize the boundaries of your system to a small level, then you're dealing with boundaries at another side that you're still not considering. So it is very challenging in the food system. That's difficult. I think the iFeed work I mentioned, I thought was a very interesting first step towards that, in also acknowledging that we don't necessarily have to have numerical models for everything, and you know, the use of very much more I guess engagement processes and ways to bring in different views and opinions and what might be done. Well, exactly, having those conversations, actually, once you confront stakeholders and actors with scenarios and your thoughts about the future, what they actually think they mean in terms of moving forward, and how, you know, how they can deal with that. And that really links well to your thinking too about not just looking at adaptation and policy and saying, well, here are the consequences, these things are all bad, or this one has mainly positive ones, so we'll follow that, but actually also thinking, how can we deal with some of those negative consequences, or simply accept them? It might be that some of them, well, okay, there is a consequence, but actually on balance that's okay, or maybe it's not. So it's around the thought framework, I think, for that, which is really interesting.
Well, and dealing with the people and the actors that might be losing out from the start, right? I mean, that at the end we want to keep the social fabric that we're having, but that only works if we acknowledge where so to say the negative consequences are. And it comes down to, at the end, who holds the power in the system to make decisions, right? And how do we negotiate these new possibilities across a range of actors? And as I say, deal with the people, you know, both the people that win and the people that might lose out. And if we have too many of the losers, then we are running into societal conflict. And so we need to deal with that in a different way. And I think that's what we all want to avoid, going down that path. So we need different ways of trade-off analysis and management, I would say. And that's just one I wanted to point out here.
Yeah, so actually we need different ways of thinking and framing and understanding problems to start with, which maybe we don't have, or maybe or existing means that we aren't employing enough as well.
Well, I mean, for me, it's because that's my area of work. If you're really applying a systems approach, you can't avoid these questions. So it's really about operationalizing what does the systemic aspect of the food systems word really means, in terms of operationalizing new ways of doing research, but much more new ways of implementing innovation and finding innovation and assessing innovation and negotiating pathways forward. And I think we can still do a lot. I mean, I think we're just at the beginning of really applying the power or the difficulties of learning about the systemic aspect of the system.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that also touches on some of the themes from coming back from the breakouts around the need for more cooperative approaches too, that if you move to that systems view, inevitably, once you start to cross these traditional boundaries, people need to think about communicating and working together in ways that maybe we haven't. Fascinating. Thank you very much. Does anyone else have any questions they'd like to raise, or anything I've missed in the chat you think we should be picking up on? I think okay, thank you very much. I think in which case we will move to, if we could bring up the slides, and we'll move towards closing. So yeah, basically the next steps really are that there will be a post-event survey. Part of this will ask some similar questions, and I'm really interested to understand there's a reason for that, whether your perceptions of the risks and priorities has changed at all. We will share the recordings of the plenaries. I've yet to decide exactly how, but we will try and get those shared with you, and the slides. And we'll be working, probably the organising team initially, on summarising what we found and analysing the survey outcomes. So those are the next steps for now. But I think also engaging in the UKRI Agri-Food for Net Zero networks, another way forward, and it would be really good to link up and integrate there. Finally, just to say again, thank you very much to you all for your time and your energy and commitment to this. I think we've had some really interesting and at times challenging discussions. I'd like to thank both Luke and Judith for speaking for us today, and Gideon Henderson, who spoke on the first day of the event, as well as all the folks who've been in the breakout groups with you and behind the scenes organising and facilitating, particularly Rachel, Cameron and Yasmin at Virtual Approval, who have been working behind the scenes, making things work so seamlessly on the technical front, which has been fantastic, and you all for attending, as well as DEFRA for funding the work supporting this, and our academic partnership, UKRI, Food Standards Agency and the Global Food Security Programme. I can just see there's one last. Is there a way to stay in touch? What happens after? I will, in the initial sense, I will, I think I can still contact you all through the Eventbrite, but we may try and set up some kind of way of keeping in touch around that that's a bit more robust, a bit more permanent. So yeah, we'll be looking into all of those things. So thank you ever so much, everyone, for taking part and for working so hard, and please do enjoy your weekends now. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. Bye everyone.
Thank you.